All right, so we're recording, and I'm very pleased to welcome Brett Gelino back to Eastern virtually. Brett graduated in 2016, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Um, and he is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Kansas in the Department of Applied Behavioral Science. And he will be telling us about his work in behavioral economics and sustainability. So take it away, Brett.
Thank you for that. Again, really happy to be here. Been looking forward to getting back into the Eastern bubble as much as I can, even if it's just virtually. It's been a long time. Time really flies. But again, thank you. I've been looking forward to this since you reached out about it. Today, I want to kind of take two different directions. Most directly and prominently, I want to talk a bit about my work, the research that I've been conducting since leaving Eastern back in 2016, how I've brought the degree from psych science to an area that I think is really exciting, and I have a lot of passion for this research, so I want to talk about how I got to this point. And along those lines, talk a little bit about my sort of research journey and how I think I was able to find what I think is a little bit of success here, in that, again, I found something that I'm passionate about and that I see some longevity with. So I think that story makes most sense to begin, again, with Eastern. I graduated, as James pointed out, or Dr. Diller, in 2016, started up as an undergrad in 2012. Happened to have some fortune in overlapping with Dr. Diller in my intro to psychology course. He was my instructor, and I presumably did okay in the course and was able to have some conversations with him. And that led to my filling in a role at the end of my first year, starting my second year, in the behavioral lab of emotion psychophysiology, LEAP lab, alongside him and Dr. Salters Pedno, which was huge for me. It was kind of a turning point in my academic career. It was a point at which I realized the value of research and how much I appreciated it. Gave me an opportunity to talk about research, get my feet wet, and do some of the stuff that those folks had planned, and conduct some of the research that I thought was particularly interesting. But I think most importantly, it was a lot of opportunity to talk on these things and to discuss critically what's being done well in research, what's not being done, and just get excited about those topics and see where, there's inroads and what we can be doing. And this really kind of culminated in 2 years of involvement in the research lab, at which point, by the end of my junior year, I had been thinking pretty heavily about graduate school and wanting to pursue that research line on my own, doing whatever research I could. And it just so happened that I took a course along that timeline that was called Sustainable Behavior. My understanding is that course is still being offered now, but maybe not as regularly. No, it's not, unfortunately. Okay. This is a really important course for my undergraduate career, because it was at its core a pretty simple idea. We were just exploring behavioral psychology, behavioral intervention, the principles there. But we were using sustainability and climate change as sort of a medium or a backbone for exploring these concepts. So there was a big practical component to this course where we were tasked with actually making some sort of intervention, some sort of change on the campus, particularly aimed at sustainability. So myself and one of my classmates, we looked at decreasing, or trying to decrease, the energy use of residents in nearby dorm hall, which ended up being something of a tall order. And I don't know that we had a ton of success there. But it was really informative, not only in that these principles of behavioral psychology have so much application, can do so much and to change behavior and are so scalable, but also that it's not always as straightforward as it seems like it's going to be, and that there's a lot of complexity there. And that excited me. I liked that a lot. I had always had an interest in sustainability and recycling specifically, and these different areas of application. But it wasn't until this course that I realized that there was such a heavy overlap and a possibility of interface there. So being on the cusp of graduate school applications, I really wanted to continue, if I could, this line of research, continue to see how far the boundaries of this intersection lie and where I could probe those out. And I just happened to get, again, really lucky and found that there was indeed work being done, specifically in Dr. Derek Reed's Applied Behavioral Economics Lab at the University of Kansas, where he had already been looking a little bit at the intersection of behavioral psychology and sustainability. But I think the methods that he was using, and I'll go over those here in a bit, but specifically behavioral economics and their applications, provided a lot of flexibility and a really nice framework for bringing this science to the world of environmental assessment and environmental policy. So this is where I am now. I'm in my 6th year. As Dr. Dilla pointed out, I just passed my comps. I'm a doctoral candidate, so I'm almost there, which is exciting. I've been in my 5 years here really trying to figure out what this line of research can and does look like, and how I can find my own niche here. And in that process, I've been working towards my degree in behavioral psychology. I've done some classwork on the side for the master's degree in environmental assessment to see if there's more overlap than maybe is obvious. And I've really kind of, I think, produced an interesting track of research that it tells an interesting story. And I think the starting point here is kind of where I was at again when I was leaving Eastern and just getting into KU. This is a slightly older IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group of scientists that are looking at collaborative approaches to resolving some of the leading global issues as it comes to the sustainability crisis. And I think this report is more representative of the timelines. It hasn't changed too much recently, but the timeline of where I was at when I was really digging into this literature. And at the time, they were calling for involvement of all sciences, truly all STEM fields, trying to get some sort of progress made and some promise for development and resolution. But particularly, they were looking for 2 different approaches. One in the area of adaptation, which is broadly just dealing with what is. We know that we've already made changes to the global climate. We know that sustainability crisis is here and that we're going to be facing some repercussions for the foreseeable future. So how can we shift our society to deal with those now inevitable changes? And that involves, necessarily behavior, because there's only so much technological change that we can implement before behavioral change has to follow. And a similar idea for mitigation, right? We are looking to curb further change. We know that there's the risk of runaway change if the global temperature exceeds a certain change, and dealing with that threat that's looming on the horizon, and how can we potentially shy away from that and move towards a more sustainable footprint as a whole. Again, technology can only get us so far. Both of these areas seem pretty ripe for behavioral focus. So early on, I wanted to find out what has been done within behavioral psychology, and particularly behavior analysis. What's being done from an empirical standpoint? Who's actually doing work? What does that work look like? And how successful has it been? So I tried to put together something of a systematic review, and I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. I tried to cast a pretty wide net. So I looked at 3 of the leading aggregators of scholarly science, and I came up with as many keywords as I could that would cover that realm of sustainability, being mindful of the idea that back in the 70s, we weren't really calling it climate change. It was more concerns of our litter or resource management, conservation, preservation, those sorts of terms. So based off of this set of keywords, I found about 52 articles, again, empirical in nature and published in behavior analytic journals. So across the x-axis here, we have Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, Behavior Social Issues, Behavior Modification, Behavioral Intervention, Journal of Organizational Behavior Management, and Behavior Analysis and Practice. So again, not necessarily all of what's being done in behavior analysis, but certainly what's being represented in the behavior analytic journals. And again, keeping a key focus on empirical work. So something that has an experiment built in, not just conceptual discussion of what could be done or what should be done or what's been done wrong. Unpacking this a bit further, just as a cumulative record goes, looking at how these things have been published over time, it certainly seems as though there's been a renewed interest since about 2015 or so. There have been far more articles, or at least a greater rate of publication than there was for a solid 30 years, which is concerning when we see the relatively stagnant rate of publication for that long span of time. We were enthusiastic as a field from 70 to 80, but then it really dropped off. And I think that in large part can be attributed to the increasing complexity of the problem. At first, it was, again, oh, we see some litter on the sidewalk, we can deal with that. But as soon as it became obvious that it was something more than just picking up litter, we kind of phased out because it's not an easy thing to approach and tackle from a behavioral standpoint. Slicing this a little bit differently, we have an array of different target behaviors, primarily invested in energy, looking at reducing our energy consumption via an array of methods, typically these sort of simple interventions that are resource conservative. They're not expending a lot of energy, they're not expending a lot of money. But there has been a decent smattering of approaches that have been evaluated, which is really promising to see. So here we see these empirical studies broken out by intervention type, where most have more than one intervention being implemented. And this is a nice display because we see a lot of work being done, again, in this area of really low resource cost implementation, a lot of prompting being done. So reminding folks, hey, recycling is good for the environment, or turn your lights off before you leave the classroom. A lot of low-cost antecedent interventions, like moving the recycling bin closer to where the waste is being produced, so folks aren't having to go out of their way to find it. These are great. These are great demonstrations of behavior analysis to scale. They show a lot of promise for creating change in these nice, clean environments, such as a college, university, or an office building. But when it comes to these more outside the box applications that I think have a little bit more scalability to them, things that might be a little bit more convincing to a policymaker, there's not a lot of work being done. And I want to draw your attention specifically to this area of behavioral economics up here. In that work, I've only found 2 studies that had a behavioral economics method to them. And I will note that one of these I kind of forced the process because it was something of a pseudo-empirical study. It was using data archiving and some data mining to frame a past capture of behavior using a behavioral economic method. In my work to date, it seems as though a lot of policymakers and the social scientists that are working with them are actually versed in behavioral economics, but from a microeconomic standpoint. So that work is being valued. It's just maybe not being exhibited in the frequency or manner that is typical of more policy direct applications. So I think this is an area that we could be doing a lot of work.
Could you define behavioral economics for our audience?
I will in a little bit. So I will talk about that here in a moment and unpack some of those methods and where that promise lies, for sure. Before I get to that point, though, there were a couple studies that we wanted to do to just kind of get our feet into this area of behavior change, and not necessarily going to the scalable behavioral economics stuff, but just seeing playing our hand at some of the more localized behavior change. And so the first of these studies, and one of the ones that I did early in my graduate career, I actually inherited these data from David Jaginski, who did a lot of advocacy work on the university campus on this particular study. We wanted to see not necessarily if we can increase composting as a whole, composting being a recycling method where we can reuse organic matter, we break it down to its particle format, and then we can use it as fertilizers or other means of adding nutrients back into our soils. We didn't necessarily want to see if we could increase composting overall, but we wanted to see if we could increase appropriate composting. Because when we have compost, what we have is a bulk of organic waste, grass clippings, food wastes, things that will break down into something that degrades easily and then is, what we call humus, a rich fertilizer. Too much inorganic matter in a compost yields that product unusable, and it could potentially actually have detrimental effects if it's put out into the environment. So if we were going to roll out composting in some of these university settings, we need to make sure that folks can do it well. So David wanted to use some pretty simple antecedent interventions here. On the right, on the tan bin, that was our baseline bin. It's representative of the trash cans that were already present in our dining halls. So nothing too out of the ordinary. It doesn't jump out at the user. It doesn't claim itself to be anything unique. And then on the left, we have our experimental bin or our modified bin. Obviously, it looks quite a bit different. It stands out. It's got a different color. It's got a little bit of an increased response cost, and there's a hinged door, so folks actually have to think a little bit before they're just tossing their waste in there. And then some placards up top with some information on what can and can't be composted. And very simply, we put the baseline bins out, we collected some data, and then we replaced them with our modified bins and saw how things changed over time. Granted, we did see something of a drop off in the amount of waste pending the weekdays that we were looking at and doing some data collection. But generally speaking, what we found was that very straightforward modifications to our bin was enough to increase the rate of appropriate composting. So on our y-axis here, we have proportion of contamination. We want to see this as low as possible. We want to see suppression here. And while we didn't get perfect rates, we did see a much dramatically reduced rate of contamination as compared to our baseline. So this seemed promising to us. We communicated these results to the university and they took hold of it. They didn't implement all of our recommendations, as it tends to be the trend, but they did indeed like the idea that there was promise here. And so we can see some of the placards that are representative of what we tried out, and some of the coloring seems consistent. And these compost bins are now being used around the university. So again, nothing too expensive here, just looking at simple interventions. Along those lines, KU went through something of an interesting formatting change over the summer of 2018. They rolled out a tobacco-free campus policy. So it was years in the making, and we actually were able to have some of our behavior analytic folk on the board, the planning board. So they were involved from the get-go in making this implementation happen. But they looked at means by which they could curb all tobacco use on campus, and they arrived at a complete prohibition. So getting rid of all possession and use of smokeless and combustible tobacco products on our campus. And this seemed like a really interesting and valuable opportunity to determine whether or not, with using very simple behavioral methods, could we evaluate the effect of a policy? We kind of took this to the planning board for a while and struggled to come up with a solution because generally speaking, it's not direct observation of people smoking isn't always straightforward. You can put a lot of money and time into it and still not record what you're looking for because you're in the wrong place, you're at the wrong time, or you're observing the wrong people. There could be tons of smoking happening, you're just not capturing it in your observation. So all that planning goes to waste. So while not necessarily the absolute capture of behavior, we kind of resolved to instead pursue measure of cigarette butt outcomes and looking at how many cigarette butts were scattered around certain areas of campus. And we had a really nice, again, because we had behavior analytic folks and psychology folks involved from the get-go, our surveys that were rolled out prior to the implementation of the tobacco-free policy incorporated this heat map, wherein members of the faculty, staff, and student body could indicate up to 3 places where they most commonly saw smoking occur. And we see a really clear pattern here. Darker red signifies more cumulative clicks. And so we have sort of this central location with all of the student academic buildings. We have a graduate student building that's largely inhabited by, it's one of our larger academic buildings, lots of graduate student offices there. And then we have our student union and some of the freshman dorms that are pretty clustered together. So it seemed like a really nice opportunity to, again, evaluate how well behavioral interventions can lend to a policy evaluation. So myself and one of my colleagues went through and performed several baseline sweeps. We were looking at a week accumulation of cigarette butts as each data point. So we needed to perform a sweep to remove all traces of cigarette butt litter so we could look at clean week-to-week accumulations. It's kind of hard to see here, but these bags in the back contain multiple of these bags in the front. So I mean, all in all, we collected upwards of 7,000 cigarette butts, I think is what we calculated. It was a lot of work, but it was also really rewarding to see those areas cleaned out. And I think the data kind of speak for themselves in terms of the success of the implementation. Now, there are some clear limitations here that we can see right from the get-go. We only have 3 points of baseline data collection. We don't necessarily have stability. And in some of these baseline areas, we have a clear decreasing trend. So there are concerns as to how much experimental control we're showing here and how much trust we can put in our intervention. And I kind of want to put this in air quotes because I think this is a great demonstration of one of these areas where certainly it appears as though we have a pretty potent effect of our policy, but the emphasis that we place in our field in behavioral psychology as a whole on tight, rigorous empirical demonstration of control, you could also look at this skeptically. So I don't want to spend too much time here. There's other things I want to talk about, but this study is something that we're still unpacking, and that on the one hand, we want to decide, yeah, this is great. Look, we have this really clear demonstration within the confines, the neat boundaries of a university, that a policy had an effect, but we were looking at the outcome of that policy, and that we were looking at permanent product and not necessarily the actual behavior. And there are some limitations in empirical design. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. What does this say about our field? There should be a clear demonstration of policy effects, and yet it's not. So are we able to scale this type of intervention? That's kind of a big question mark, at least in my mind. But either way, this was data that the university was happy to see, and I think a pretty solid demonstration that just banning cigarette butts on a campus has some effects. Now, changing gears a little bit and talking about behavioral economics, as I promised I would. As I mentioned, I'm in Dr. Derek Reed's laboratory right now, finishing up, and his specialty is what he calls applied behavioral economics. So behavioral economics as a whole is a means that we can quantify and better understand choice when it's placed under constraint. So whether that be increasing cost or delayed access of the desired reinforcer or whatever that may be, we can usually evaluate this in something of a broader standpoint. So more individuals at once, we can frame more behavior at once. And it also is something of a parsimonious approach, in that it incorporates a lot of different aspects of behavior in one really nice display. So the first of these, and something, I'll talk about some studies that incorporate these methods here in a bit, but the first of these, and that which I think has a little bit more promise as it comes to sustainability and climate change, is this idea of discounting. And here we have pictured delay discounting, or this idea that as the delay to some outcome or to some valued outcome increases, so too does the devaluation of that outcome. So we value that thing less. And oftentimes that means that as we're waiting for that delayed outcome, so maybe it's fiscal responsibility and good financial health and stability, maybe we're looking to have some sort of nest egg put away for our resources, for our expenses, a savings, if you will. That's something of a larger later reward. That's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. And while it's something that we value and will be largely valuable to us in our life down the road, that distance is still something that we need to deal with. What happens oftentimes in a delayed discounting framework is what we call a preference reversal, wherein some smaller student reward of certainly lesser magnitude than that, say, financial responsibility and financial health, that thing crops up along the way and exceeds the value of that larger later reward because it's so far off in the future. So maybe we find that someone's having a sale, or we want to spend money on something impulsively. We do that because it has smaller immediate, it has larger immediate value to us, even though in the grand scheme of things, it's lesser in value as compared to the ultimate outcome. So this is something that we can look at in a range of commodities. We can look at or try to use this as an explanatory factor for drug addiction or risky health choices. Things like, I want to be in shape for the summer, but I'm going to have a slice of pizza now. I want to be a healthy individual, but that cigarette or that extra glass of wine looks nice really, right now. It's a framing that we can use to look at impulsive choice. And this is really helpful, I think, for understanding some of the problematic decisions we make as it comes to climate change and sustainability. I like the idea of having a sustainable footprint, but the idea of getting in my car and driving myself right now because it's cold and I don't want to wait for the bus, suddenly that public transportation is outweighed and outvalued by our immediate options. And not going into too much detail here, but what we can do using any behavioral economic method is typically arrive at some data points. And in discounting, this is what we call indifference points, wherein we are indifferent between the reward that comes in the future and the reward that's available right now. And that is sort of a framing of that larger later reward and its devaluation in terms of the immediately available reward. Basically, we can plot these things, and then we can use nonlinear regression and field models to better understand how decision-making plays out as constraint increases or decreases, even beyond what we're able to directly assess. Similarly, we have a different method, and one that's, I think, of comparable value in understanding some of the framework or concerns surrounding sustainability and behavioral psychology. We have this idea of operative demand. And here we're looking at constraint of consumption or engagement with a particular commodity when there's a price placed on it. And that might be monetary price, or it might be work expenditure, it might be a number of responses we have to admit. Regardless, we can engage in a similar pattern of behavior where we can collect some data, whether that be actually asking people to engage in a work task, or simply asking them from a survey standpoint, how much of this commodity would you purchase at these different prices, or how much would you be willing to pay for this commodity? And there are some certain metrics here that are of value to us. I just want to draw your attention to this value here, Pmax. This is the point at which we're likely to switch from defense of our commodity to kind of like a free fall. We're no longer willing to defend. It's too expensive. And so any prices greater than this Pmax value, this price max, are likely to see precipitous drop off of defense of that commodity. So this is an important commodity price point for us, because if we're looking to say decrease engagement with the commodity like cigarettes or alcohol, we might want to price points to the right of this. If we're looking to increase engagement with a commodity, we might want to price points to the left of this. If we're looking at something like sustainable energy or bus tickets, we want to make sure that we find that Pmax and keep that price wall to the left to ensure as many people as possible are still engaging in that behavior. So making use of these frameworks, we wanted to kind of take our own little journey and see how many different areas these things apply to and what the actual applications really are. And first off, and most simply, we wanted to see, can we actually create something of an operative demand task related to a commodity that has relevance in the sustainability sphere? And most readily and kind of popular in the conversation in sustainability at the time was reusable shopping bags. So very simple task. We asked folks, if prices varied from a cent up to $10 per reusable bag, how many bags would you purchase? One of the things that we wanted to do to make this a little bit more interesting, shake things up a bit, we implemented a survey called the New Ecological Paradigm Scale, which is a survey metric that allows us to better understand, or in theory, is a reflection of people's concern over human environment interactions. So higher scores represent more concern, thoughts that humans should be having a smaller carbon footprint, and that humans are not dominating the environment. It's a human environment relationship that's fragile, those sorts of thinking. And what we found was that those who had more concern for the environment were actually taking less bags when they were free, but were willing to defend their consumption and use of reusable bags at greater prices. So on the right here, we see an expenditure curve, which represents how much money is being spent by each group at each increasing price point. And we find that those who are more ecologically conscious are also spending more money on bags, but are taking fewer bags when free. So this is preliminary in nature. It's interesting, something that could be unpacked further, but I think representative for us that we can actually do stuff with these tasks, and that there's promise here to unpack something of potentially larger value. Logical next step in terms of targeting some larger value for us was gasoline. Gasoline and fuel consumption, from a population and community standpoint, has historically been framed using behavioral economic methods and has been shown to have some qualities that are reminiscent of almost an addictive-like commodity. People are continuing to expend money to secure that commodity well beyond what's reasonable for their budgets and well beyond what's reasonable from a standpoint of just price points. So we wanted to figure out what was going on here, and can we actually arrive at any sort of decrease in demand for this particular commodity of fuel. And given that fuel is typically priced at these very specific, down to a tenth of a penny price points, we decided that we wanted to expand our assessment of prices and include what we call a high density price framework. So we had folks, again, hypothetically report how many gallons of fuel would you purchase at each of these prices, but we looked at something like 54 price points, where we had a really high resolution view between $3 and something like $7 per gallon. We had a by 10 cent increment. And from a kind of zoomed out view here, nothing too substantial. We see that prices begin to precipitously drop off at about $3, $4, exactly what we would expect given real world data and our own choices. But we're still seeing, decent expenditure rates, folks willing to spend, upwards of $40, $45 to fill their tank as prices increase. So looking like we're capturing something reliable here. Where this gets a little bit more interesting is if we zoom in a bit, we find that we've actually managed to capture something of a left digit effect, where after each whole price change, there's an irrational change in consumption. Not a monumental or huge consumption change, but enough so to suggest that folks are highly sensitive to that price change. Now, again, this is something of a preliminary probe to see where we can make inroads and what these methods can show us. And I think that this is most obviously just a demonstration of sensitivity, that we're actually modeling something of real world value. We know the left digit effect is a thing. Marketers have known it's been a thing for decades now, and we've captured it here. So that's pretty cool. I think there's also something here in terms of potentially reducing fuel consumption. I don't know what that is, because we have something of a free market here, and forcibly setting prices is not generally seen as a desirable approach. But having something of a sticky price point around whole dollar changes suggests that we could actually potentially be making something of a decrease in fuel consumption from a community level, and even a slight decrease per person has pretty profound potential to make a difference at the community scale. So something, again, that I think needs to be unpacked further, but nonetheless, interesting preliminary data. Now, running with this line of work, for my thesis, I wanted to take the fuel consumption idea and bring it into the household and look specifically at home energy use. And this was inspired in large part by changes in the Douglas County, Kansas area where I live. On the left, we see the breakdown of generation of home energy by type. And in Douglas County, we had a long-standing and old and out-of-date coal plant that had been providing the majority of our energy for a long period of time. There had been rumors for the last 4 or 5 years about decommissioning. They actually just announced in the last 3 or 4 months that they were going to move forward with decommissioning, and they were going to overhaul that location and turn it into a recreation area for the Douglas County population, which is really exciting. But that does introduce something of a gap in terms of energy generation. Where are people going to be getting their energy? How is this going to affect pricing? How is this going to affect people's day-to-day decision-making moving forward? And this is some data that were put forth by our energy supply company, Eversource, which I think is comparable to where Connecticut is getting a lot of their energy, which is a little scary to admit. But they were predicting that a lot of it was going to go towards renewables, but I suspected that more is going to be coming from that sphere than maybe they were wanting to lead on. So I wanted to figure out, again, how does behavioral economics lend to this understanding, and where can we potentially make some inroads here? Given that the region in which you reside is likely to have some influence on your decision-making as it comes to renewable energies and energy as a whole, I use what we call Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk. It's a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to recruit individuals who are specifically willing to do what they call human intelligence tasks, or things that require uniquely human input. And survey research being one of them. We need humans to do that. And it usually offers a really nice representative sample for the country. So each of these green data points represents a source of some of our data. A lot of it came from cities, which is great to see, but we also did get a pretty nice smattering from more rural communities. And again, running with this hypothetical approach, we asked people to imagine that their typical energy provider had just been bought out by a larger regional energy provider. And that regional provider was then trying to find out how they could better supply the individual customer. What is it that you're looking for? If we're going to be changing your commodities, how do you want this to look? And we kept an emphasis on a framing that looked a lot like your energy dashboard if you went to go change your utilities today, because that's where a lot of us are making our decisions. So trying to keep a lot of those natural antecedent stimuli that are present when you make these decisions in the real world. So generally, what we had people imagine is that there was the option of receiving 100% renewable energy. The standard opportunities for electricity are still available, so you don't have to opt into this opportunity. And for many of these folks, we're basically saying, you are not opted in already. You are in your typical brown energy source. This is available to you if you want it, but you don't have to pick it. So this produced some challenge, because generally speaking, if you ask people how many kilowatt hours do you want to buy this month, most people are going to look at you blankly, because that's not a metric that has a lot of value to folks. Most people pay their bill and still have no idea how many kilowatt hours they consumed this month, last month, this week, last week, even today. So we changed it up a little bit, and we just stuck with price per kilowatt hour, but then we made this custom to the respondents' world. So we multiplied price per kilowatt hour by the average per person per month kilowatt hour usage, and then multiplied that again by the number of people that respondent said resided in their household, to yield a per month energy cost based off of that per kilowatt hour pricing. So in other words, as each of these prices increases, how much is your household likely to pay, and what percentage of your income your monthly income is that likely to encapsulate. And for some folks, again, we said that you're not opted in. Do you want to opt into this opportunity? For others, we said that you are already opted in. Would you like to opt out? So we tried to come up with something of a small wording framing here, something of a nudge, if you will. When we stack all these data on top of each other and just aggregate across all of our groups, both opt-in and opt-out, again, we find a pretty prototypical demand curve, nothing too special here. I want to point out that our Pmax value, that point at which we said anything to the right of this is likely to result in a lot of people dropping out of our energy costs, that was at 20 cents per kilowatt hour, which for the average household is about $66 a month or $800 a year. So I think for most, somewhat representative of what they typically pay, maybe even a little bit under the typical price point, depending on your particular preferences for energy consumption. But when we split this out based off of opt-in and opt-out, we find something a little bit different. And this is consistent with the literature in the more big E behavioral economics, those who are in the economics fields, and those who are already working with policymakers. They're already onto this idea of nudging and environmental modification, these small wording changes. But what we found is when you are already opted in, when you're already by default placed into this green energy source and given the option to leave that energy source for savings rather than go into it for expenditure, you're willing to stay in that green energy source at far greater prices per kilowatt hour. Almost, a 10-cent increase, which is likely to result in another $400 or so per year. So pretty significant difference compared to what we had at 15 cents. So once again, what we have here is a sensitivity of these behavioral economic tasks to detect differences in decision-making based off of not only simple nudges or simple left-right changes, left digit changes, things like that, but also promise of informing policy relevant changes. If we just simply told folks who are opting to get into the energy grid that they had to by default be in the green energy sourcing, we're going to see far more of that community maintaining their role in that green energy sourcing as opposed to switching to the cheaper brown energies, which is going to be really, really important too as we continue to see more and more coal and oil plants decommissioned in the years ahead. Changing gears slightly here, a lot of what I've discussed to this point has been mitigation efforts, looking to curb our carbon footprint and reduce the amount of imprint that we're making. A lot of the work that we've been looking at too has in some way or another had a role in adaptation, dealing with what is, ensuring that we're able to stay safe, ensuring that we're able to deal with, say, the wild weather patterns we've been experiencing and whatnot. Here we see a Noaa satellite radar from the 2017 hurricane season, which is at this point considered to be the fourth worst hurricane season on record. You can see moving through Mexico now and approaching southeast Texas, that's going to be Hurricane Harvey, which dropped 60 inches of rain. That set the record for that region of hurricanes. Moving in here shortly, we're going to have Irma, which hit Florida, was the longest lived Atlantic Category 5 storm in the satellite era, lasted 3¼ days. That did some heavy damage to the Cuban, Florida area. And then here in a couple days, and you can see days here on the 9/5, September 6th, Maria should be coming into view here in a moment. And that was the hurricane that did tremendous damage to the Puerto Rico infrastructure, left a lot of that island in desperate need of overhaul and really crippled a lot of the habitability of that island. And I think this is, unsurprisingly, this is going to be an area that we need to continue to focus on as we move forward. These hurricanes are going to be, I think, one of the, or not even hurricanes, natural weather patterns and deviations that we're witnessing are going to be one of the most palpable and noticeable effects, immediately so, of climate change. And so dealing with the chaos of extreme weather is an important aspect and something that I think behavioral psychology has a lot of capability of making contributions to. And so this is kind of a twofold approach. This also has a lot of obvious mitigation benefits in that reducing congestion and getting people out of their vehicles and out of traffic is important. But traffic also is going to be one of the major barriers that we have in successful evacuations. And evacuations are going to be things that we're increasingly seeing as these storms continue to ramp up in not only ferocity, but frequency. So one of the projects that I was fortunate to be a part of early on was a collaboration between my laboratory, that of some application developers for Metropia, which is an app that's being rolled out right now in a lot of the some major cities. I think Houston, New York City, Boston. Some of the individuals in those areas are having access to this now. This also brought in some of the experts at the new National Renewable Energy Labs in Golden, Colorado. But what our role was pretty straightforward, using the methods that I've already discussed to figure out how much behavior people are willing to put out there to secure points that are offered from this Metropia app. And Metropia at its core was simply requesting that folks change their departure time and or their arrival time and or the route that they're planning to take so as to avoid congestion on the roads. So we can see this has a lot of value in places like LA, where there's just insane traffic all the time, but also during times of evacuation when everyone is trying to leave at the same time, having folks spread throughout these different routes of escape are going to be potentially valuable. But just from a forefront, trying to figure out if this application would even produce behavior change, we found that folks were willing to change their behavior upwards of 40 minutes, meaning they were willing to leave 40 minutes later, which would necessarily entail getting to their location, likely a little bit later. Ideally, it wouldn't be too much later, given that they would be avoiding congestion and not traffic, but 40 minutes seemed to be the value that mattered. And we can't necessarily say whether these data here were of absolute mapping onto the behavior that they were trying to capture. But certainly it seems as though there was some social validity and some appreciation of these data, and definitely some value found from these companies based off of what we were able to produce. So these are some snapshots from Metropia's website as of now. They're still citing behavioral economics in multiple locations, and to our understanding, our contributions were the only behavioral economic contributions that were made for the development of this app. So I think, this promises at least some value had in this work, not necessarily tremendous inroads, but certainly sort of social appreciation, right? Along the lines of evacuation, extreme weather, one of the projects that I was also lucky to be part of, and this is something that Dr. Reed has had a lot of focus in, given his personal experiences with extreme weather in the Midwest, we looked at how we can critically evaluate the means by which we warn people of extreme weather. And here we looked at specifically tornado warnings, given their unpredictability and the oftentimes very little amount of lead time you have to engage in the proper precautionary behavior and seek shelter and do what you need to do. So what we did, once again, was used our Amazon Mechanical Turk crowdsourcing platform. We recruited individuals from the 20 most tornado-afflicted states of 2018, with the unfortunate reality that we didn't get anyone from Oklahoma. But generally speaking, we were able to get a smattering of folks from all the other major tornado states. And we just asked them, what is the likelihood that you would immediately stop what you were doing and seek shelter if given the amount of lead time presented here? Lead time being how much time between the delivery of the warning and the projected impact of that tornado strike, where we would expect less immediate action when there's more lead time. If I have 30 minutes before the tornado is likely to hit my area, what am I going to do? Probably go outside and see what the sky looks like and see what's going on outside, not necessarily immediately find the basement. And that's obviously exceedingly dangerous, because if there's an unpredicted change in that tornado strike, that can put us at tremendous risk. For those who are not familiar, the tornado science is actually far from as sophisticated as I thought it was. There's no great satellite means of identifying our tornado. The primary means that that's done is still by firsthand account and spotters. So folks literally go outside and say, hey, the sky looks green. I should probably call and let people know that there might be a tornado in my county. So things are really unpredictable. We need people to be acting quickly and promptly and safely. So we tried to modify the tornado alerts to incorporate some best practice language. On the right here, we see descriptive conditions, where we incorporate what we call impact-based warnings or wording, just basically more explicit language as to what threats are being posed by that particular storm. But we still tried to also look at some of the different language that might be used that varies across region and across warning rollout. So use of the term tornado conditions versus tornado warning, and seeing how all these things differ. And we used one of those discounting frameworks where we again plotted the likelihood of seeking shelter and figured or tried to approximate the devaluation of that threat when it's further out. So what we have here is two conditions, the descriptive standard and the descriptive warning, that are producing more prompt action across all of these lead times up to about 90 minutes. So what we have is at about 50% of our groups are likely in these descriptive conditions to immediately seek shelter, stop what they're doing and seek shelter at a 30-minute lead time. And what we found was a decent overlap with leading research. This was an archival study by Simmons and Sutter here that looked at some of the more deadly tornadoes in history. And they found that those deadliest storms were those that had a warning that preceded the storm by more than 15 minutes. In other words, longer than 15-minute lead time produced less action on this part of the warning recipients and thus more casualties. And that mapped on perfectly to what we found in our more typical or prototypical warnings, those that would have been rolled out in that study. 15 minutes or so and folks are no longer willing to take prompt action. So the fact that we were able to, even in a hypothetical standpoint, not only capture that framework, but also potentially double that using just different wording, proves really promising for the use of these methods for, again, capturing policy relevant changes in behavior at scale. So in wrapping up here, I think there's tremendous value in these methods and continuing to probe the boundaries of where behavioral economics and broadly behavioral psychology can make inroads in the area of sustainability. There's a lot that needs to be done. And a lot of this can be accomplished by having pleasant interactions with policymakers and continuing to create those relations as much as we can. And that might mean, on one hand, getting more folks into the polling stations, those who would be willing to support science and ensure that data and our policy and action is data-driven and empirically sound. And that might mean, another project where we're looking at from a behaviorally grounded standpoint, how can we get people to ensure that they're registered to vote and actually active in the political sphere. But it also might mean, as scientists, continuing to create those relations with policymakers, continuing to present our work in a way that's packaged and desirable and easily implemented in the manner that policymakers need. So understanding what it is that they need. So again, continuing to engage in this political environment. I think it also, and as I mentioned, particularly during some of the hypothetical pieces and the cigarette butt study, there are some criticisms that can easily be applied to some of this work. How empirically sound is it? Is it actually representative of the behavior that we care about? And I think that these are going to be questions that we're going to grapple with if we allow ourselves to, an extended amount of time in the future, which is time that we don't necessarily have. And I don't want to go on too much of a commentary on this particular point, but it does draw to question whether there is some compromise that needs to be made in the methods and the ways in which we're generating the data that can then be used by policymakers that has societal relevance. If that compromise does need to be made, then we need to have a discussion as to where that compromise can be made, what compromises we're actually making, and the extent to which we can compromise on the methods that we think are hallmarks of a sound empirical science. As it comes to graduate school as a whole and kind of the journey that brought me here, at first I used to say in something of a not so encouraging sense that we're just chasing the carrot being following this incentive, following this valued reinforcer, this valued outcome, but never actually being able to achieve it. And I think I've kind of rebranded my framing on this over time. I think that's probably an accurate representation of a lot of what we do in science and academia, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's great to create these lofty goals that maybe we don't fully ever realize. Maybe it takes trainees to realize them, or future generations, or folks outside of our particular discipline to realize them. But in trying to chase this carrot and change the way that we frame our science and our own particular work, and again, speaking as a graduate student here, I think it's absolutely critical to find the passion in your work and find something that you enjoy doing, even if you're not doing the particular research that you want to do. Setting goals and trying to achieve those goals, whether it be learning new statistical methods or better understanding your own scientific rigor and how that fits into your interests. Finding passion is going to help so much in the long periods of drought that you might experience as it comes to contacting the good stuff that comes at a later day. And all the good stuff is worth waiting for, but oftentimes it is a long wait. I've also found a tremendous amount of value in engaging in service opportunities, not only in just feeling good and feeling like I was able to give back and apply what I know and what I've learned along the way. But I've also contacted a lot of value in working with folks who I create great relationships with, fleshing out something about professional identity through my service opportunities, and really learning a whole lot more about what's being done and what can be done out there. These last 2 points, I'll put them both up at the same time because I think they're kind of related. Along the way, I found that it's absolutely important to be open to feedback, particularly because in my own experience, I found that feedback happens and is put out there less and less. There are fewer and fewer occasions in which you can get good feedback as time goes on. And that feedback is so valuable just in keeping yourself grounded and on track for what you want to be doing and how your work is actually contributing and if there's actually value to it, and being open to that feedback and incorporating it. But simultaneously avoiding those who are just naysayers and discouragers and who are going to find negativity in everything that you do. Will always find a reason that something will not work. Those folks, oftentimes, they're not the most beneficial to have around. Sometimes, you want a little dose of that because everyone needs a little bit of grounding, but too much and it's not, it's no longer helpful or advantageous to your career, at least in my experience. Thank you again for letting me rant at you for 50 minutes. I really appreciate it. It's been a great experience.
Thank you so much, Brett, for sharing your expertise. It's always very exciting to see students graduate from Eastern and then do better work than their faculty mentors. And, so I'm really, really pleased that you shared with us. For our question and answer period, I'll go ahead and turn off the recording, but so that people might be a little more forthcoming. But thank you so much again, and we'll do Q&A now. I see Janae.